Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to Family Values Alliance Ballarat. And as you know, the topic for tonight's meeting is the impact of same-sex marriage and gender ideology on culture. And so tonight we're going to be looking at a few of the areas. We'll be looking at how same-sex marriage opens the door to radical sex education in schools, which sexualizes children, promotes dangerous gender ideology, threatens children's health, and undermines parents' authority and their rights. We'll be looking at how it robs children of a biological parent. They lose the equal right of a biological mum and dad. Children become a commodity. And we'll be looking at how it creates legal inequality and discrimination against anyone who believes in marriage as a sacred union between one man and one woman. A lot of people don't know same-sex couples already have legal equality. I want to say that again. Same-sex couples already have legal equality. There was legislation put into place in 2008, and that was the Equal Treatment in Commonwealth Law's General Law Reform Act. So you will often hear an emotional plea, we don't have equality. Well, actually, legally, they have equality just as everyone else does. Now, sometimes they might say, oh, but we weren't treated like the next of kin. Well, the laws that are made to protect de facto couples are exactly the same laws that have been made to protect same-sex couples. So if a de facto couple, whether that couple be heterosexual or homosexual, isn't treated as a next of kin, then that's something that needs to be addressed separately to same-sex marriage laws, because that's something that would apply to both heterosexual couples. If someone goes into surgery and they're denied access based on, oh, well, you're not next of kin, whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual couple is irrelevant. That's discrimination regardless, and both should have that equal right under the legislation, the Equal Treatment in Commonwealth Laws Act, for both de facto and same-sex couples. So if you hear a same-sex person saying, oh, but we weren't treated like next of kin, well, that's a problem with the system. That's not a problem with the law. And people need to know that, because often that's a very emotional plea that is used by people who are wanting same-sex marriages. We don't have legal equality, but that's actually completely wrong, completely inaccurate, and people need to know that. People are told over and over certain things about those who are opposed to gay marriage. So I'm actually going to address some of the things that are said. They're told that they are hateful and bigoted homophobes. They're told that they are opposed to democracy. They're told that they will damage lives. They're told they are against human rights, that they're in favour of discrimination, that they are against love, and are stupid and backwards. And these things you will commonly hear in many different forms about anyone who supports a sacred union of marriage between a man and a woman. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each one of those individually. So I'm going to start off with they're hateful and bigoted homophobes line. Now, there are actually many people who don't support same-sex marriage that have close friends in the LGBTQI community, friends that they love and respect. Just because they don't agree with same-sex marriage does not mean that they hate someone. And a big lie is disagreeing is hating someone. To disagree with a person is not to hate a person. We need to be very careful not to confuse this. In fact, many people within the gay community are opposed to same-sex marriage. I was listening to the video of a man, and he talks about, I'm gay and I'm voting no, here's why. And in the video he says he as a gay person has been accused of being a homophobe. Now let's just think about that for a minute. A gay person is being accused of being homophobic. So let's just take a moment to stop and think. Obviously, people aren't listening to what people are saying. They're just making an assumption that if you're opposed to same-sex marriage, you have to be a hater, which is completely inaccurate because so many people within the gay community are actually opposed to same-sex marriage. But you won't find a lot of people in the gay community speak about it because just like anyone else who opposes it will be shouted down by the gay lobby bullies, they will also be shouted down by gay lobby bullies. They treat their own just like they treat the members of the heterosexual community. Some people have concerns about same-sex unions because they know that radical sex education programs have followed legislation of same-sex marriage in many countries. And I'm going to unpack that a little bit further in the presentation. But that's a legitimate concern that people have, and to say that you shouldn't be concerned about that when history has proven over and over again in Britain, in Europe, in Canada, in America, that once same-sex marriage is legalised, the rights of parents regarding the sex education of their children are taken away. So that's a very legitimate concern that we have seen. And even without the legislation of same-sex marriage, we are already seeing radical sex education within Australian schools that many parents are extremely concerned about. One person writes anonymously because they also fear the harassment, not of Christian conservatives, but what they call being a target of the gay Stapo, and this is someone within the gay community, okay? So the big secret in the LGBT community is that there are a significant number of gays and lesbians who oppose same-sex marriage, and an even larger number who are ambivalent. You don't hear us speak out because gay rights activists, most of whom are straight, have a history of viciously stamping out any trace of individualism within the gay community. I asked to publish this article under a pseudonym, not because I fear harassment from Christian conservatives, but because I know this article will make me a target of the gay Stapo. The wheels of my Pride Parade float came off the moment I realised that the argument in support of gay marriage is predicated on one audaciously bold-faced lie, the lie that same-sex relationships are inherently equal to heterosexual relationships. It only takes a moment of objective thought to realise that the union of two men or two women is drastically different arrangement than the union of a man and a woman. It's about time we realise this very basic truth and stop pretending that all relationships are created equal. No matter how much we try, same-sex couples will never be able to create a new life. If you find that level of inequality offensive, take it up with Mother Nature. Redefining marriage to include same-sex couples relegates this once noble institution to nothing more than a lousy love contract. This harms all of society by turning marriage, the bedrock of society, into a meaningless anachronism. So that's written by someone within the gay community. Another person, Katie Force, speaks out. Now, Katie actually anonymously was speaking out because she was hearing so many what she felt were lies about children of same-sex marriage parents. And as a child of a lesbian couple, she knew a lot of what she was hearing was not true. And she never actually would have spoken out publicly under her name except somebody outed her because they thought she needs to be held accountable for her comments. So because she's been outed, she's now become one of the biggest advocates for children's rights. It's a very difficult subject to speak about, she says, because I love my mum. Most of us children with gay parents do. We also love their partners. You don't hear much from us because as far as the media are concerned, it's impossible that we could both love our gay parents and oppose gay marriage. Many are of the opinion I should not exist. So you can see that even people within the LGBTQI community are discriminated against and are bullied when they actually speak out about the harms they see in having same-sex marriage legalised. The next one I'm going to unpack is they talk about those who disagree with same-sex marriage are opposed to democracy. Well, I would say democracy, true democracy, allows for freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. And history has shown us over and over again, whenever same-sex marriage is legalised, that those freedoms are taken away. In Ireland, after gay marriage was passed by a referendum in 2015, Parliament wasted no time repealing laws providing exemptions allowing religious, educational or medical institutions to maintain the religious ethos of the institution when it came into conflict with gay rights. And that's been the truth in the countries that have legalised same-sex marriage, that any laws for protection of religious freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, are taken away within a very short time. So people need to not be fooled by the argument that it won't affect you. It will actually affect every Australian that believes in marriage as a sacred union between one man and one woman. They will be discriminated against at some time in the not too distant future. Now, the next one I want to look at is people are told over and over that those who are opposed to gay marriage will damage lives. And they often refer to the high suicide rates among LGBTQI people, although the causes for the high suicide rates have never actually been proven. And there's been many studies to show that there are a lot of other reasons for mental health issues, and we know mental health plays a big factor in suicide rates, and there's many other reasons for mental health problems among the LGBTIQ community. And some of those reasons would include things like fatherlessness. We know fatherless children have higher rates of mental health problems, higher rates of criminality. Lots of issues are created from fatherlessness, and same-sex marriage creates fatherlessness for children of lesbian parents. So we're automatically creating children in a disadvantaged situation when we legalise same-sex marriage. Glamorising the LGBTQI lifestyle damages life, I would argue. Young people act on their feelings. Reasoning and consequences have not yet kicked in because the frontal cortex lobe, that part of the brain that looks at consequences, that's not fully developed until 24, sometimes later. So young people tend to react on what they feel. And we've got some very dangerous teaching in schools that goes with the LGBTQI lifestyle that's based on feelings. And that includes things like risky sexual practices that leads to high rates of STDs, high rates of lots of problems. Some of the educational material within the Safe Schools program talks about managing STDs. It doesn't talk about avoiding them, it talks about managing them and regular visits to doctors. If you have AIDS, you can take a pill for AIDS, so you know it's not the end of the world if you get AIDS. So they're actually minimizing the risks associated with the homosexual lifestyle. And I've even seen a report, a health report that talked about the higher rates of STDs, which are astronomical, the real figures, when you look at homosexual as opposed to heterosexual STDs. And I read one report and it said the higher rates of STDs were due to discrimination. And I thought, well, last time I checked, you had to actually have sex to get an STD. You couldn't actually get an STD through someone discriminating against you. So that just goes to show how far the arguments have gone and how people who buy that argument that everything's due to discrimination are actually buying a lie. Because there is no way STDs are higher due to discrimination. It's due to risky sexual practices. And we need to be very aware of that. I was reading one article on a health website in Australia funded by the Australian government. Thank you very much for that. And in this website, it was talking about STDs, and it was making the assumption that you probably are going to want to have sex on your first date, but if you have a recent STD diagnosis, then you shouldn't really have sex for 2 weeks to be safe. But you probably need to find a way to tell that person on the first date, without disclosing you have an STD, some kind of an excuse, so that when you get together on your second date, you can still have sex and it'll still all be good. So there's an assumption that people want to have sex on their first date. I still come from a society that believes that sex is a really sacred act and should be reserved for special relationships. And promiscuity, we know, leads to problems emotionally as well, psychologically as well as sexually transmitted diseases. The LGBTQI promotion being glamorous, I think that damages young lives. They're told over and over that if you support same-sex marriage, you are against human rights. Well, I'm not going to talk about a human right. It comes from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, part of the Human Rights Commission. And in Article 6, it states that parties recognise that every child has the inherent right to life. Article 7, the right to know and be cared for by his or her parents, their biological parents, their mum and dad. And the right to not be separated from his or her parents against their will, except for the best interests of the child. For example, when they're being abused in the home and the best interest of the child is to remove them because the parents are abusing them. But those reasons that you would remove a child, we recognise this is not ideal. We recognise that children thrive when they're in a good home environment with their biological parents, their mother and father. Margaret Somerville, Professor of Bioethics, the School of Medicine at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, writes, "Many people deprived of their biological father by being born from anonymous sperm donation tells us that they would not have consented. They describe themselves as genetic orphans. They say, 'Half of me is missing.' And they ask, 'How could society have allowed this to happen to me?' Likewise, would they consent to being born of a surrogate mother or created from 2 men or 2 women? So again, it's robbing the child of their biological father or mother when we have same-sex marriage. And we are creating what has been referred to here as genetic orphans. Heather Barwick was raised by her mother and her mother's same-sex partner. She's a former gay marriage advocate. She strongly used to advocate for it. But after some time, she turned and became a children's rights activist. And she talks about in her journey how it was very difficult to actually talk about the truth of feeling unhappy within a home, because there was so much pressure to hold up the gay standard of gay homes do just as well. And there was so much pressure from within the gay community to look like it was great that you couldn't speak about the problems that you experienced. And many children of same-sex married couples say the same things. She says, same-sex marriage and parenting withholds either a mother or father from a child while telling him or her it doesn't matter. That it's all the same, but it's not. A lot of us, a lot of your kids are hurting. My father's absence created a huge hole in me, and I ached every day for a dad. I loved my mum's partner, but another mum could never have replaced the father I lost. I grew up surrounded by women who said they didn't need or want a man. Yet as a little girl, I so desperately wanted a daddy. It is a strange and confusing thing to walk around with this deep down, unquenchable ache for a father, for a man, in a community that says men are unnecessary. So you can see a lot of people have been very wounded by the loss of a parent. Another one that speaks out is Millie Fontana. She is an atheist, a daughter of lesbian parents, and born by a sperm donor. She wrote, "When they chose what parts of my identity were acceptable to reveal to me, they took something from me. It turns out I have an uncle, I have an auntie, and I have a grandmother. If I had not met my father, I would not be standing here with you today, because my emotional reaction to not having him in my life, even at such a young age, was devastating." Nobody in the LGBT lobby wants to hear from someone like me. There is a huge silent majority of us that are sitting around feeling very silenced by this debate. And she went on to say, "Equality is about being able to look at both sides of my genetic family and understanding who I was. Lie from the LGBTQI community that children don't care who their family is and that men and women are interchangeable. I consider this in itself to be a form of gender discrimination." And I think she makes a very good point. Then we have a father who had left his wife and became involved in a same-sex relationship. And Doug writes, "I eventually came to the conclusion that I had committed a grave injustice against my kids. They deserve to be raised by both their mum and dad under the same roof. Who was I to deny them this most basic of children's rights?" And he actually left his same-sex relationship, started a platonic relationship with his wife for the sake of the children, and they re-fell in love during that time, and the kids have finished high school and they're still together. The next one I want to talk about is that being told that you're in favour of discrimination if you are against same-sex marriage. Well, same-sex marriage discriminates against those who hold a religious or conscientious beliefs that marriage is between a man and a woman. And an example that we have of that is the Catholic Archbishop of Hobart, Julian Porteous, who was taken to court for a booklet on marriage given out in Catholic schools. Now, a Catholic bishop should have the right to talk about their biblical beliefs in a Catholic school. However, because this booklet talked about marriage between a man and a woman, he was actually taken to court. And they actually dropped the case, but I believe from what I've heard, the reason they dropped the case is they knew that people would then know the things they're saying now, oh no, religious freedom will still exist. They dropped the case because they knew they could no longer say that if they kept prosecuting this archbishop. The truth is, that's the only reason they dropped the case, and they will go fervently after anyone who disagrees with same-sex marriage if it ever becomes legislation. And I want to say something to those who think same-sex marriage is inevitable. It's not. The only thing that is inevitable is death and taxes. We're all going to die and we're all going to have to pay taxes. And I've seen some polls that say there are more people against same-sex marriage than there are for it. The media will not highlight any of those polls because the major media is biased. And we all know the things that we see in the media will only be the biased things. One of the best examples of recent bias is how Channel 10 actually created fake news by photoshopping an image of a poster onto a bus stop and saying that this was seen all around Melbourne. And that was all rumour based on a tweet that was sent from one person to another, and it was actually based on a poster in the US, and someone tweeted a gay activist and said, oh, this poster's been seen up in this lane. Melbourne City Council went and looked at the lane. There was no sign of that poster. Not one single poster could be found anywhere in Melbourne. So Channel 10 decided to create the news and basically to say, look at what the No side has done. Look at this awful poster they've plastered all around Melbourne. Now that's a really good example of the media bias, where they've actually slammed the No to same-sex marriage campaign by creating fake news that is inciting hate. Another example of discrimination is that in Sweden, priests and pastors are told to get another job if they don't want to perform same-sex marriages. It's really that blunt. People are being put into prison in Europe for expressing their views on traditional marriage. So same-sex marriage creates more discrimination than people understand or realise. A few examples. Now, this person is gay and he was part of the New South Wales Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby. He was very active for the lobby. He works for News Corp as a journalist. And because News Corp prints both the yes and no side of the same-sex marriage debate, he was targeted by the Gestapo, that's what they called it, the Gestapo. They targeted him that he wasn't good to be on the gay and lesbian rights lobby. So he was discriminated against as a journalist by his own gay lobby, as a gay person. Many people have heard about the owners of an Oregon bakery who denied service to a same-sex couple, and they've paid more than $135,000 in state-ordered damages. And the person who owns the bakery writes, even though I'd happily served this couple in the past for another event, I couldn't participate in a ceremony that violates my beliefs. And so she is sued not because she hates someone, but because her conscience says, I can't support same-sex marriage. She obviously doesn't hate them because she served them in the past, and many people that have been sued, it's a similar story. Now, in Belfast, this couple, owners of a bakery, were asked to print a slogan on a cake, support gay marriage, with the two Sesame Street characters. They were actually asked to print that onto a cake. And because that violated their freedom of conscience, their conscientious beliefs, they said they couldn't print that. So they were also taken to court and they were prosecuted, found guilty. They went to the appeal, and the appeal court ruled that Ash's Bakery acted unlawfully when it refused to decorate a cake with a political pro-gay marriage message. The verdict is a defeat for freedom of expression, as well as meaning that Ash's can be legally forced to aid the promotion of same-sex marriage against their wishes. It also implies that gay bakers could be forced by law to decorate cakes with homophobic slogans. It seems the judges have decided that businesses cannot lawfully refuse a customer's request to propagate a message, even if it is sexist, xenophobic, or anti-gay, and even if the business owners have a conscientious objection to it. So there's lots of discrimination. Now, another sad case is Brian Barkley, who worked as a volunteer for 20 years for the British Red Cross. And he was sacked for expressing his belief in no same-sex marriage. And there's an article that was written sometime before this, and they talk about Brian is an extremely conscientious and committed volunteer. So this extremely conscientious and committed volunteer is sacked for his belief in traditional marriage, in marriage as a union between a man and a woman. Again, more discrimination. Social work student Felix Noggle was kicked out of his course at Sheffield University as a social work student for writing on Facebook that marriage is between a man and a woman. The committee said its decision was not based on his views, but the act of publicly posting them may have caused offence to some individuals. So there's no freedom of speech. If you exercise freedom of speech, you will be discriminated against. Graduates of a planned law school at a Christian university in British Columbia that forbids sexual intimacy outside heterosexual marriage will not be able to practice in Ontario, that province's law society decided. Many members of the Law Society of Upper Canada's Board of Directors condemned the policy as abhorrent. The policy, which you can see written lower, is that they have to abstain from gossip, obscene language, prejudice. They have to abstain from prejudice, get that? Harassment, lying, cheating, stealing, pornography, drunkenness, and sexual intimacy that violates the sacredness of marriage between a man and a woman. And that's referred to as an abhorrent policy. Trinity Western University, which plans to open a law school in the fall of 2016, requires students to abide by their covenant. So here we have another clear case of discrimination. Many have heard about this florist, and Baronelle Stutzman. She's the sole owner of Arlene's Flowers in Richland, Washington, and for her entire career served and employed people who identify as homosexual. She obviously has no problem with the homosexual community. She's served them, she's employed them, she's worked alongside them. But her conscience around same-sex marriage is that it's not right. Her conscientious belief is that it's a sacred union between a man and a woman. And because of that, someone who she had served many times in the past took her to court, and she's potentially going to lose her business, her home, everything she has, her retirement savings, all because she refused to do specialised flowers for a wedding. And my understanding is she actually said, if you want to pick arrangements that are already done, generic arrangements, that's fine. She let them know about other florists in the area that could support them. So it wasn't like she was hostile in any way. She did everything she could, and it really grieved her to not be able to support them, but her conscience could not support same-sex marriage. But she found it a very difficult situation. And this is really a warning for all small business owners that might be involved in any small way in a wedding. Printing invitations, photographers, any business that's not willing to go and support same-sex marriage, print slogans on a t-shirt. There's many small businesses that could be discriminated against if they believe in sacredness of marriage between a man and a woman. People are told over and over that they are against love, and I'm sure you've heard the love is love slogan over and over again. It seems to be being beaten out. And the majority of people respect people's right to do in private what they choose. However, they recognise that same-sex marriage has far wider ramifications than two people getting married. And I've already discussed quite a few of those, the ramifications on children. And the other ramification with children is some countries now have even replaced mother and father with legal parent. So no longer on a birth certificate, no longer will mother and father be recorded, but legal parent. So children won't necessarily have access to know who their biological mum and dad is as a result of that legislation. And people are told over and over that those opposed to gay marriage are stupid and backwards. Well, I've already talked about many of the good reasons why people would choose not to support same-sex marriage. And it's actually quite offensive to call people stupid and backwards. Like, that's offensive language. If you support same-sex marriage, they're actually name-calling by saying those things. I want to quote Masha Gessen, who is one of the biggest activists within the gay lobby, and one of the things that she said is, fighting for gay marriage generally involves lying about what we are going to do with marriage when we get there. Because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change. And again, I don't think it should exist. And I've heard a few different places where lobby activists actually, in the end, they want it, but then they don't really want marriage to exist. So it's really quite twisted, the thinking. We already have many attempts to legalize polygamous relationships, polyamory. And there's a book that's just been released in the US, Legalizing Plural Marriage, The Next Frontier in Family Law. And the book discusses how it's actually not that far away. The description of the book says, polygamous marriages are currently recognized in nearly 50 countries worldwide. There we have that same argument you will hear for same-sex marriage. Look, it's already legalized in all these other countries. Why don't you legalize it here? Well, that's the same excuse they're going to use for polygamy. Although polygamy is technically illegal in the United States, it is practiced by members of some religious communities and a growing number of other poly groups. In the radically changing and increasingly multicultural world in which we live, the time has come to define polygamous marriage and address its legal feasibilities. So people who think that it's going to stop with same-sex marriage, it's naive to think that it will stop at same-sex marriage. It's naive to think that changing the definition of marriage will not then change other definitions of marriage. The lifelong union of a man and a woman in marriage is unique in its capacity to provide the potential for both the procreation of children through the bonding of complementary sexes and the security for children of being raised by both biological parents in the context of a lifelong commitment between them. No other kind of relationship inherently provides this. Every other relationship by design robs a child of a biological parent. Do we want to design marriage laws so that they don't have a mum and dad? Yes, bad things happen. Parents divorce and split up, and in those cases, single parents do the best they can. But do we want to actually design it so that kids are disadvantaged in that way? Another example of where freedom of religion and conscience is gone, Vishnitz Girls' School, a Jewish school, where the teaching of Jewish and religious studies was singled out for praise by inspectors in its first Ofsted report of July 2013. Ofsted is like the body that goes and says, yes, you're okay to keep your school open. No, you need to close your school, okay? So this school was presented with an ultimatum: teach your children about homosexuality and gender reassignment, or we will close you down. So to say that same-sex marriage laws don't impact sex education in schools is completely wrong. We've seen it over and over again in many countries. This Jewish school is just one of the most recent examples. They're being told, you have to close your doors unless you teach gender reassignment. Now, gender reassignment surgery, there is no scientific conclusive evidence that it is the best thing for a child. There's none. The medical associations have pushed it, they make a fortune out of it, but there's no proof that it actually improves outcomes for children. Another example, and so judge ruled that parents have no right to know what homosexual activists taught their children in school. And I believe this one is actually talking about the parent who went to the school and said, I want to know if they're going to be teaching so I can be present for the class. And their kindergarten student, they were denied access, and not only that, they were actually handcuffed and taken down to jail where they spent the night for objecting to their children having to have radical sex education at a very young age. So parents often are denied rights to know what their child is being taught in school, and we've certainly heard that from several parents regarding the Safe Schools program in Victoria. One parent actually recently spoke about how their daughter had a very detailed lesson on masturbation at 13 years of age, which is sexualizing children. Children are being sexualized through radical sex education programs. They're being taught to transition their gender at young ages. And evidence says that children who don't transition and change genders at a young age, up to 98% of them actually are comfortable with their birth sex once they become an adult. It's not necessary for them to go onto hormones and lifelong treatment of drugs and expensive surgeries. And again, I can only say that the big pharma companies who are providing the hormones and the medical associations that make all that money from the surgeries are part of the campaign behind keeping this alive. Now, comprehensive sexuality education is actually a worldwide sex program, and if you look it up on YouTube, you will see some very disturbing information. And I just thought I would draw your attention to one of the particular lessons where they're talking about what is abstinence. And you can see here, this list on what is abstinence includes oral sex, it includes vaginal intercourse as abstinence. So you can see the comprehensive sexuality program is teaching children very mixed, wrong ideas. And it's comparing saying I like you to oral sex, or to a massage, or to holding hands, or to vaginal sex. It's comparing them all to the same thing. And so children are being taught really wrong ideas about what sex is in sex education classes, and this is happening worldwide. If you want to know a little bit more about the impacts of same-sex marriage, there is a great YouTube video, What Gay Marriage Did to Massachusetts, and if you look that up on YouTube, he will enlighten you about many of the impacts that there's been legally and socially and culturally in the state of Massachusetts. And we would be silly not to learn from recent history. We would be naive not to take note of what has happened in other places that have legalized same-sex marriage. The American College of Pediatricians writes, human sexuality is an objective biological binary trait. XY and XX are genetic markers of male and female, respectively. not genetic markers of a disorder. The norm for human design is to be conceived either male or female. Let me repeat that. The norm for human design is to be conceived either male or female. Human sexuality is binary by design, with the obvious purpose being the reproduction and flourishing of our species. This principle is self-evident. The exceedingly rare disorders of sex development, DSDs, including but not limited to testicular feminization and congenital adrenal hyperplasia, are all medical identifiable deviations from the sexual binary norm and are rightly recognized as disorders of human design. Individuals with DSDs do not constitute a third sex. And I'm going to go now into talking a little bit more about the gender ideology impact on culture. And so the American College of Pediatricians has a statement around how putting young children on puberty blockers and hormones is unhealthy. It actually damages their health. And they talk about how puberty is not a disease, it's a normal part of growing up. And how children often may be confused by feelings. Remember, feelings are not facts. And one of the major problems with gender ideology is it teaches feelings as facts, and it takes facts, being born a boy or a girl, and turns them into, oh, that's just a social construct. No, male and female is an objective fact. It's not something that we should be questioning, and it confuses children to question it. It takes concrete things and it makes the world very confusing. So, gender ideology, to know a little bit about it, you have to understand where it came from. Dr. John Money, one of the founders, had a theory that gender is a social construct. So, instead of male and female being binary traits, no, that's just a social contract. You're only female because society tells you that you're female if you're born this way. So you can see how the truth was completely twisted in gender ideology. And if you have a look at some studies around Dr. John Money, you will find that he experimented on a young boy who he turned into a girl, and it was a huge failure, but he hailed it as a success, and that was what was used to really get the transgender movement into action, strong action. And so his idea of proving nurture being more important than nature, he was a complete fraud. He was pedophilic in nature because he showed photographs and had the twins perform incestuous acts within his office. So this man is one of the major founders of the transgender movement and gender ideology. So you need to understand that this is where this teaching comes from. Now, the American College of Pediatricians talks about environment and vulnerabilities, and they say no single factor or factors destines any child or children to develop gender disorder. Clinical case studies suggest that social reinforcement is one of the potential causes. And that's when society says, oh yes, you're transgender. Yes, you feel like you're a boy, so you must be a boy, even though you've been born as a girl officially. So societal reinforcement is actually a big issue right now because it is confusing children and young people. They say parental psychopathology could be a factor, and family dynamics, certain things within families. Adverse childhood events not limited to sexual abuse, and social contagion facilitated by mainstream and social media. And I think we have to be really aware social contagion is a really big part of what's happening with the transgender movement at the moment. You look at Bruce Jenner, who has so much glamour in being Caitlyn, and that's causing a lot of social contagion. It's saying through the mainstream media that this is normal and it's glamorous, and it's making a lifestyle that has lots of issues, both with mental and physical health issues, as if it was a healthy choice. Michelle Cretella writes, the fact that in normal life and in psychiatry, anyone who consistently and persistently insists on anything else contrary to physical reality is considered either confused or delusional is conveniently ignored. And so she's talking about, as a pediatrician, how transgender ideology has infiltrated the field and produced large-scale child abuse. We know with all other illnesses, mental health issues, eating disorders, someone believes that they're fat when they're really skinny. Body dysmorphic disorder, where someone feels like my arm should be cut off. We treat the feelings. We don't cut their arm off, or we don't say, yes, you need to lose weight. We don't buy into the unreality of the person. Yet here, we're buying into the unreality and we're affirming what shouldn't be affirmed, to the point that we have a 52-year-old man identifying as a 6-year-old girl, and people are accepting that as being okay. This is kind of the impact of same-sex marriage. We have a couple that were married in 1990 in a ceremony in San Francisco, a lesbian couple, and the little boy that they adopted has started a sex change at age 8 because he and his lesbian parents always knew he wanted to be a girl. So we have children growing up confused about their identity as a result. Many people regret transitioning from male to female or female to male. And one of them writes, I just wanted to be male, but I was always going to be trans. And that's actually the truth. You cannot change from male to female. You can look more like the other sex, you can change bits, but your chromosomes will always be female or male, whatever you were born with. You cannot change who you are. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's presentation. I'll be staying around if you have any questions. So thank you very much.